Hello and welcome to the Discover Reading podcast. I am Chris Stiliani and I'm joined today by my co-host Phil Everington. We'll be joined by Dr. Mark Dallas and Professor Gary Stevens, who will be discussing COVID vaccines and therapeutics, but also all the other innovative vaccines and therapeutics that are used to treat other deadly diseases. Enjoy. So if I could get both of you to please introduce yourselves, starting with you, Mark, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us about your main areas of research.
Hi, Chris. So I'm an associate professor in cellular neuroscience here at the University of Reading, and I'm hosted by the School of Pharmacy. My research looks to uncover mechanisms of disease and specifically looking at the brain, so interested in Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, I'm a professor of pharmacology at the University of Reading in the same group that Mark works in. My research interest is in ion channels and receptors, and I'm what's called an electrophysiologist. So I like to stick glass electrodes into cells and record electrical activity. I'm interested in brain diseases that are involved in abnormal electrical activity, things like epilepsy within the brain and maybe just outside the brain in the pathways that signal pain.
Fantastic. Yeah, just wanted to, as a kind of a quick sort of basic question to kick things off for you, Gary. I know people are probably quite a lot more familiar with pharmacy as a term, but you are the director of pharmacology at Reading. So could you give us a very basic layman's description of what pharmacology is?
Yeah, pharmacology is the study and the science of drugs and how they work on living systems. I guess as pharmacologists, we try to discover new medicines to improve existing drugs and try to understand why some drugs work better in some individuals than others. We've got a BSc pharmacology program where we're teaching students to become the pharmacologists of tomorrow.
Fantastic. So would you meet a pharmacologist in a hospital, say, or is it in the labs behind closed doors?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the easiest way to make the distinction is if you study pharmacology at Reading, you'll become a research scientist. So you'll go and work for a big drug company or maybe in academia, become an academic like Mark and myself. So the drug companies that you'll have heard of, AstraZeneca, obviously in the news at the moment, GlaxoSmithKline. I guess as a pharmacist, you'll be more working giving medicines out to the public. So you might go to work for Boots and places like that, rather than GSK and AstraZeneca and Pfizer and these type of places.
All right, fantastic. So due to the vaccinations, we look like we're in a good position in the UK. And the Prime Minister mentioned that there could be new drugs on their way being developed to treat COVID, which is a little suspect, I know, but would be wonderful. So I guess two questions. Could you talk us through the drugs that are currently being used to treat COVID? But first of all, both of you quite hopeful about the short to medium term. And if I start off with you, please, Mark.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a great time to be in pharmacology, and it's great to see pharmacology in action, and specifically at this rapid pace. If we think where we've come in the last year in terms of science and research and the way that's having an impact on people's life and how we return to normal, I think that's a real credit to the scientists and the pharmacology that's underpinned the research that's developed the vaccine, and also given us a little bit more knowledge about some of the drugs that are being used to aid recovery from COVID-19. So I don't know if Gary wants to pick up on his thoughts about the progress, and then we can mention some drugs that people might have heard of.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just echo what Mark says about the vaccine. I think, if given the speed that the vaccine has been developed and let's say, again, cross our fingers, the success not only in preventing people getting severe forms of COVID, but also the spread of the disease, which is also incredibly important. I think that's been a massive effort, and we should be very proud of the scientific community and AZ in particular for helping the team at Oxford getting that vaccine to the general public for the first time throughout the world. So I think that's been amazing. I guess one of the issues with drug development is it's always going to be slower. So the thing that we would tell our students is that typically developing a drug from scratch would take minimum of 10 years, 10 to 15 years. So it's a real drawn out process. So what we're looking at the moment is probably reusing or repurposing existing drugs, maybe some antiviral drugs, maybe some drugs that treat underlying inflammation. The pharmaceutical industries have been very quick to respond. There are several drugs that are very close to being approved for use in COVID. But again, it's always going to lag a little bit behind vaccine development, and vaccine is probably the gold standard way in which we want to go anyway.
Yes, I think what Gary was mentioning, a lot of the drugs that are currently being used in the front line are drugs that have been used in treating other diseases, and they've been what we call repurposed to try and offset some of the symptoms that people experience with COVID-19. One of the classes of drugs that has been successful are the ones called corticosteroids, and in particular one called dexamethasone that people might have heard about. So dexamethasone was originally synthesized way back in 1957, and it was approved for clinical use in 1960. So if we think that even in today's world in 2021 we're using a medicine that was developed way back then, shows in essence how we can repurpose drugs to actually treat and manage new diseases that crop up on the horizon. So I think that just goes to show that the evidence that's required to support using new drugs, or indeed repurposing drugs to tackle new diseases.
Okay, fantastic. You both mentioned, for example, clinical trials there. What is the trial process for a new drug, or indeed a drug which is being repurposed? How does that work? Are there 4 stages?
Yeah, I guess, initially there are 2 main aspects. First of all, whether the drug is safe, which is very important. And secondly, you might think these should be the other way around, but whether it works or not. So there's numerous examples of where a drug that looks safe in what we call preclinical trials, once it goes into the human population, doesn't prove effective and can even cause adverse effects. And then the drug company is looking at lawsuits and things like that. So clinical trials are incredibly important. There are 4 stages. The first couple of stages are predominantly involved in safety, and then introducing the drug into an increasingly large population of healthy volunteers, and then patients, and then finally onto the market. So that's one kind of area where these COVID drugs, we might want to bypass the situation a little bit. So we might take drugs that have already been proved to be safe in phase 1 and phase 2 type trials, and then accelerate them through phase 3 and phase 4, because it's often the phase 1 and 2 that take a significant amount of time as well. So we might want to accelerate drugs through clinical trials, especially drugs which we think could deal with an emergency situation like COVID.
Fantastic. And I think just thinking about, so COVID is one kind of huge area that we've all been very obsessed with over the last year, but also alongside that I've been reading about what people are calling long COVID. So obviously people have had COVID and they've got symptoms that are ongoing. So I just wanted to ask you, Gary, first of all, what's your perception of what long COVID is, and also what kind of drugs might be useful for treating that?
Yeah, officially long COVID is defined as COVID that lasts longer than a short-term acute respiratory depression. Typically, the drugs that we need to think about with long COVID are going to be a different set of drugs. So as Mark said, we might take something like dexamethasone to reduce inflammation, which is going to be immediately beneficial to respiratory diseases. But long COVID may be associated with lots of other what we call comorbidities, so diseases associated with the primary disease. So these might range from pain through to depression through to other CNS disorders. And I know Mark's obviously interested in things like Alzheimer's disease, and we need to get a handle on those things. So yeah, we need to probably think about a different set of drugs that maybe treat not only the COVID but the associated morbidities that we're starting to see with this long COVID population.
Okay, great. And in a previous podcast, we heard that one of the worst things about COVID is that it's actually your own immune system that starts attacking yourself, which was quite an interesting thing to hear. How does that feed into the drugs? Are the drugs that you use for long COVID trying to fight that, or is that just simplifying things?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's simplifying things at all. I think that is, in essence, one of the challenges is the immune system. Each individual's immune system is built by their own experiences, what you've been exposed to, and that presents some of the challenges that Gary was mentioning. These inflammatory responses that our body responds to are very different in each individual, and that's why the symptom or the list of symptoms ever increases as we find out more and more about people's personal experiences of the virus and this lingering effect of the virus. So I think in terms of drugs and pharmacology, yes, we're trying to fight that immune response, trying to dampen it down, but we're thinking about that as a long-term strategy, whereas the acute phase, where people have often been hospitalized, we're looking at quite a rapid response and we're challenging our body to, in essence, overcome what that virus is doing. Longer term, these medications and drugs which might be approved are going to be more of a long-term strategy in terms of taking it and trying to manage some of the symptoms that these individuals present with.
You mentioned kind of how long-term these trials can be, so it's something that would take years, I suppose, to get to the bottom of, or which drugs are best to use? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great things as well in terms of being in science at the minute is the number of clinical trials that have started to embark on finding a little bit more about how all these different treatments could potentially offer relief in the fight against long COVID. So I think there's something like 500 clinical trials around the world trying different combinations of drugs and medicines that have been repurposed, and some new entities in preclinical studies, as Gary mentioned, to try and give us a tool set or give us a toolkit for the people at the front line to actually offer better management of long COVID.
All right, and I think, Mark, we've had a few chats about the 1918 influenza, and as a historian, I had to drag us back a little bit to go and look at a previous pandemic. But one of the interesting things when I was reading about the 1918 pandemic was there was a few writers, including John Barry, who were claiming that the influenza had quite a huge impact upon people's brains, etc. On that note, do you think there is a link between long COVID and neurodegeneration, as we saw in the 1918 influenza outbreak?
Yeah, Chris, so it wouldn't be a conversation with you without chatting about the 1918 influenza, so I'm glad you brought it up. So I guess, yeah, in terms of that brain inflammation and the, in essence, differences in brain damage that people saw back then, so science has now told us, and again, sorry to be a bit of a cop-out, we don't have direct evidence that it was indeed the influenza virus that actually caused that brain damage. It was nicely timed in terms of the period at which it presented itself, but unfortunately we don't have cast iron guarantee that it was the virus. That said, technology now and science has advanced that we're likely to be able to provide a much more concrete answer as to whether this COVID-19 virus is actually having an effect on our brains. And already there's evidence coming out in the published literature to highlight people that are suffering with their brain function. So they're presenting with cognitive symptoms, they're struggling to, in essence, remember, or well, classically what's called brain fog. And people believe that that is, again, underpinning an inflammatory response, but this time we're in the brain. So we're not in the lungs, not acutely affecting the respiratory system. We're now targeting the brain, and our brain's response actually starts to, in essence, dampen our brain's responsiveness to everyday activities.
Okay, and how do you treat that? Is it possible to treat something such as brain fog? Because I've heard in terms of other diseases causing so-called brain fog, but what I couldn't ascertain is it possible to treat it, and if so, how?
So you can do, and again, the kind of pharmacological toolkit uses steroids. So again, we can use steroids to manage some of the impact of this inflammation or swelling in the brain that might be evident. So again, it's a case of trying to diagnose it in the first instance. So putting someone into a scanner, looking at how their brain changes over time. That's why clinical trials and indeed evidence-based medicine is critical here to monitor those changes. So we've got, in essence, a diagnostic toolkit to say this person is suffering from this particular aspect of long COVID, and we know what treatment's best for them.
Mark, if I can just jump in there as well, something's kind of slightly related and slightly more controversial, I think. There has been some anecdotal evidence that people, throughout any disease, people tend to self-medicate sometimes. And there's a group of drugs that people have heard about called psychedelic drugs. Now, psychedelic drugs are probably typified by things like LSD. And of course, we kind of know that there are drugs of abuse, but lots of people advocate using psychedelic drugs for things like post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. And there's been actually some anecdotal evidence that people who are suffering from long COVID in particular are self-medicating with these psychedelic drugs. Maybe it's, like a smart drug, a mood enhancer. So I think it very much relates to what Mark was saying. Obviously, neurodegeneration is slightly different, but some of these affective disorders, things like depression, bipolar, when your mood gets changed, which clearly is going to be a consequence of having any long-term illness and things like COVID in particular. So there is some evidence out there from notable pharmacologists who are advocating the use of psychedelic drugs for people that are suffering from, long-term mood disorders. So that might be an area of also that comes to play in the COVID field as well over the next couple of years.
Okay, fascinating stuff.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I just to go back to the psychedelics. I mean, again, as a very kind of layman's approach to this, I've sort of heard things that it's kind of about breaking a cycle of people get into a very negative way of thinking, and it's about kind of trying to break them out of that and using psychedelics for that. Is that kind of correct to think of it like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's lots of examples where we use drugs that maybe the person in the street thinks that's not a good idea. So obviously at Reading, we've got kind of a history of using cannabis-based drugs. We don't actually use THC, which is the active component, but there are other things in cannabis that are medically useful. So we've obviously been instrumental in development of cannabidiol, CBD, which is now a drug that you can see, on the high street for epilepsy. There are other really good examples where you use drugs that you would not be a good idea, and particularly with the example you've just brought up there, Phil, people use amphetamine for stabilizing disorders in children like hyperactive ADHD. You'd think that would be the last thing you want to do, give, amphetamine, which again, we know is a drug of abuse, to a child that's not behaving properly. But in a medical context, it very much normalizes their behavior. So these mood swings in bipolar disorder, things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, can be normalized by drugs that we might think of as drugs of abuse. So cannabis, the use of LSD to treat long COVID, it sounds fanciful, but there is some actual, scientific pharmacological basis for putting these ideas forward.
I was listening to, there's a podcast recently where they were speaking about mental trauma, particularly from veterans, in this case from the Iraq War. They'd had trials with the equivalent of ecstasy to try and get them to open up and speak about their experiences, and they received quite positive results. So I guess you could say there is evidence that actually you can still be used in a positive way to achieve a positive outcome in a scientific setting.
Yeah, I guess the kind of adage there from the pharmacology world is it's all in the dose. I wouldn't say there's any bad drugs out there. It's all depends on how much you take of that drug. Think about alcohol. Think about some of the drugs you've been talking about. It all depends on how much of that drug you consume to what the effects are going to be on your body's system.
Maybe this is a big digression. We don't want to go down too far, but that did make me think about the conversations around homeopathy and things that are so diluted. That's at the other extreme of what you're saying. So I don't know. There's obviously a point where things are too diluted to have an effect, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the homeopathic medicines that are available are, some of the dilution factors are eye-watering, literally, and how they stand up in terms of the scientific world is they are, in essence, a little bit flawed in their presentation. So it's something we teach our students. Yes, it's there, it's on the high street. There's lots of fancy websites that present it as take this and you'll feel better and all will be well with the world. But as scientists, there's no real robust evidence to support their use. And certainly I haven't seen anything in terms of COVID, but I'm sure there's some websites out there proposing to actually offset some of the effects of COVID through homeopathy.
Okay. Well, yeah, just to get back onto to COVID, me and Chris were talking about whether you read in the news and there's all these people delayed in having their treatments because of COVID and all the cancer treatments being put back, and a real worry. And we were wondering whether that impact of COVID has led into more things to do with research. And do you feel like the amount of time people have spent worrying about COVID and researching COVID has had a negative impact on treating other illnesses in that time period? Gary, what do you think about that?
I guess clearly the overriding focus of drug development, probably within the pharmaceutical industry, is focused on COVID-19 and trying to repurpose some drugs. And again, clearly we can see that one of the big political decisions that had to be taken was around about lockdown and whether or not we needed to isolate people at home so they wouldn't just effectively overwhelm the NHS. And we've seen it in other countries at the moment. Obviously, India seems to be doing particularly badly. So we've got to think about these things. I guess if you wanted to put a positive spin on things, we said earlier, at least it's brought into focus the benefit of the pharmaceutical industry for the UK, but also maybe a more tangible benefit is probably things like we talked about repurposing drugs. So we've got drugs that are going through phase 1 and phase 2, which have been shown to be safe. So maybe we can accelerate those drugs towards development for COVID, but maybe also towards they've actually been developed for. So I think the idea about having increased research on a repurposed drug, an existing drug, can only be good. And again, maybe another tangible example here is we've been looking for cures for other diseases for several years, and probably a really good example here is malaria. So malaria kills upwards to around about 500,000 people, often children, every year in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a massive problem that probably us people in the West and big pharmaceutical industries, dare I say it, have largely ignored because there's not so much money in it. But only this month we've got our first malaria vaccine. So it may be completely unrelated, but I think that this idea that vaccine development is going forward maybe has given a push to a malaria vaccine, which we've been looking for years. Yeah. And maybe another tangible benefit here in the vaccine development is, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are mRNA vaccines, which are slightly different to what we've used in the past, and a DNA vaccine like the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. So I think there are lots of tangible benefits that have arisen probably because of COVID. Obviously we didn't want a pandemic to force vaccine development, but again, I think the idea now is the technology is in place. So one of the reasons that AstraZeneca got involved with Oxford was because they had the facilities and the manufacturing capacity. And it seems like we're worried about these new variants. But again, with a positive spin, it seems the technology is in place that if a new variant, or when, and if and as and when the new variants pop up, as they are doing now, will be very well placed to develop a new vaccine very quickly. Yeah. So I think all of these things are actually, you don't say the pandemic was good, but there has been benefits for science. And I think, if anything, if we're going to learn from the pandemic and create new vaccines, maybe help drug development in the future, that is one of the things that has come out of the situation.
That's brilliant. And with pharmacology, is there an element of discoveries are made for something specific? It doesn't work to treat that, and then it just ends up, you find other things that you can use it for. Is that quite a common thing that happens in pharmacology?
Yeah, I mean, I think best laid plans, you have a disease, you want to cure it, and there's the one drug that will do it, but often it's evidence from that drug and the clinical trials that we've been talking about, some of the preclinical research even, that pinpoints other avenues which you can take that drug down, and it might be that actually it fails clinical trials for the disease and the endpoints that you wanted to try and manage, but it opens up new avenues. And I think, speaking of just carrying on from what Gary was mentioning, I think that's one of the positives, is that our thirst for knowledge and the advancement of science hadn't stopped just because we're kind of looking at COVID-19. All this kind of research that's been ongoing, maybe the change in focus, it's all building a better picture of how we make drugs, how we make vaccines. And again, that's going to only benefit science as a global community going forward. Yes, we might have taken our eye off the ball in terms of cancer patients not being able to get to their appointments. That's unfortunate. But I think we didn't want to underestimate the scale of the pandemic. Things did have to be prioritized, and those were decisions that myself, Gary, Chris, and Phil didn't make, but those were decisions that were made. But in essence, I think from a scientific perspective, the new knowledge that we've gained throughout this pandemic is only going to benefit science further down the line if and when another pandemic hits.
I think sometimes what people miss in terms of the threat of hospitals being overwhelmed, and had our hospitals been overwhelmed, cancer patients would have missed their treatments anyway. Lockdown was brought into place to stop the health service being overwhelmed, so some emergency treatments could continue alongside COVID. Another question which I had is, it looks like potentially COVID could act as a catalyst for speeding up change. So do you think we're going to be in a better shape to combat the next pandemic for a combination of vaccine and treatment?
Yes, I think this nicely leads on from what we were kind of talking about in the previous question. Yeah, I think we'll be in a much better place. If you think that we got the genome of the virus the day after it had been sequenced, and that was then put into the public domain, we then started our work on a vaccine, and then in essence we started the vaccine rollout. That all has contributed to our knowledge, right from understanding viruses, understanding the different parts of the virus. So these are all against what we know as the one of the spike proteins. So you might have heard in the previous podcast a little bit more about the different parts of the virus. And again, thinking about vaccines, how to make a vaccine, how to make it, as we've been chatting about, safe and tolerable, getting it into patients, and then seeing how it actually then slows down and just reduces the infectivity of the virus itself. So short answer would have been yes, but I thought I'd give you a little bit more than just yes.
Maybe one point here is that I think this catalyst for new development, I think that's a really nice way of putting it, Chris, and hopefully that's going to be true. I think one of the things that maybe, again, you might have covered this last time, but one of the issues with the MERS and the two forms of the SARS viruses, they're examples of what we call zoogenic illnesses, which spread from animals into humans. Now, just even thinking about the pace of life today and the transcontinental travel, these are all kind of factors that have contributed to MERS and SARS becoming prevalent. So I think about 100 years ago, there was an average of one zoogenic illness every year. And this was due to, like, maybe in 1918 with people traveling from Spain and taking ships and bringing plagues and all these type of things. But at the beginning of the century, there was one a day. So SARS was something that's waiting to happen. So when we look back to it, it could be related to cleanliness and how we deal with, we don't want to pinpoint the Chinese in Wuhan. It could have happened anywhere. But, this idea that a virus can jump from one species to another, it's certainly facilitated by the modern lifestyle and certainly by travel and things like that. Essentially, it's an accident waiting to happen, and there's been various scenarios, and we dodged a bullet largely with MERS and the first SARS, and it wasn't something that was important to us because it didn't really spread from those local areas. It didn't become a pandemic. So these things are always going to happen. So again, silver lining, we've now got the technology. I think the vast majority of people now appreciate vaccines. I mean, we're bound to see mutations and further waves, but hopefully we've got the technology there to be proactive rather than reactive. And again, one thing just to add here, the anecdotal evidence is that there was virtually no flu last year. So even just changing our social behaviour, there are places like Japan, for example, where their average death rate actually fell last year. And it was an amazing statistic when you look at these diagrams throughout the world. But in Japan, the death rate was actually lower. And that's probably because of good social hygiene, distancing, whatever. So there are things, aside from developing new drugs and vaccines, that maybe, again, is beneficial to come out of this.
I thought that was a brilliant point. Actually, I did want to mention Japan, because there are lessons to be learnt maybe in terms of the way humanity interacts with nature, but also on a smaller national scale, the way in which you react when a new virus is present as a society. I don't think it's had a full-on lockdown, but it appears quite early on society just adapted to the new situation. I believe there was quite a lot of mask wearing, quite a lot of ventilation on public transport. They naturally socially distanced, so still going to restaurants but with more social distancing. Is this a lesson for society which we could take next time around?
Yeah, I think the way we live our lives going forward for the foreseeable future is going to be different, and that's potentially going to be around hygiene, just reinforcing the need for hygiene, particularly in closed spaces. We're in the higher education sector, so it's going to be something that's going to be at the forefront of our minds, in essence, to keep staff and students safe.
Fantastic. And then just a big concluding question from me, and you may have kind of different opinions on the answer to this, Mark and Gary, but you wanted to know what you thought the most important drugs in the last 10 years to have been developed are. So, Gary, what's in your opinion?
Thank you for coming to me first. That's like asking what your favourite record is, or it changes from time to time. So I won't say favourite drugs, but I guess the main things that we would measure kind of successful and important drugs by are probably things like Nobel Prizes. There was a Nobel Prize back in 2015 for basically plant-based herbal remedies that were very useful in fighting a number of parasitic diseases. There's a plant-based drug that was developed against malaria that was very successful. So these are all really important. The FDA produces a list of drugs, and every year there's about 50 new drugs developed. Typically, the big things over the last 10 years have been anti-cancer drugs. So oncology has been very successful in the pharmaceutical industry. And again, maybe things called biological drugs. So biologics are things like antibodies. So the top 10 best-selling drugs now are dominated by monoclonal antibodies. So again, we didn't really talk about antibodies against COVID. We've talked enough about COVID, but that's another way in which we could target the protein with antibodies. I guess maybe from a pharmacological point of view, we're always looking for like beautiful stories about drugs. So I think the story that I always like and tell the students about are developing specific drugs against targets. There's a drug that's been very successful that's also been in the news because the company that developed it are charging a lot of money for it, but they've developed it against cystic fibrosis. So there's a transporter that pumps out too much chloride, and a beautiful story of rational drug discovery was to design a molecule that fitted in and activated that transporter. So if you can potentiate the chloride transport, you can nicely alleviate the symptoms of cystic fibrosis. So yeah, those are ones that I can think of off the top of my head. Mark's probably got a completely different set of drugs.
Well, yeah, and I'm gonna go for something that's an underdog. So being a Scotsman, a big fan of the underdog, and completely non-rational. It's something I tell the students, and it maybe talks about what we're thinking about that accidental discovery. So it's a drug called minoxidil. It began its life as a cardiovascular drug to manage kind of high blood pressure, and it's not so common now, but it was used quite prevalently. And the story behind this is that actually through clinical trials, let people and clinicians observed that it actually started to potentiate hair growth. And so now minoxidil is the active ingredient of that well-known hair regrowth shampoo. So again, it's thinking about how, in essence, the best laid plans and the astute observations of the clinicians and pharmacologists running the clinical trial gave us the opportunity to develop a new drug. And that's certainly something that not all of us here on this podcast will be using in the future, but it might be something that comes in handy further down the line.
I've got an image of, these clinical trials of people just covered in hair, and I'm thinking that's not what we were aiming for.
Yeah, that wasn't the plan, but hey ho, let's roll with it.
And then we had another similar type of question of what do you think the most important drugs being developed now for the future are and will be? Gary.
Again, maybe I'm just repeating myself here. I think, the vaccines against malaria and these diseases that are big killers, I think those type of drugs are going to be massively important. And a lot of the drugs that we're looking at the moment are repurposed from things like AIDS was probably the last big concerted effort by the pharmaceutical industry to sort out viral disease. So at the risk of repeating myself, I'd probably say developing things against malaria and these type of parasitic diseases that kill millions of people in the third world.
And Mark?
Yes, I think the future bodes well for pharmacology. And again, I guess one of the positive things from the COVID and the pandemic is inspiring the next generation. So all those people at school thinking about their career paths, and hopefully it enlightens them on a career path in science. What does the future hold for pharmacology? I think one of the interesting areas that we've got a personal interest in is nanobodies. So this area of pharmacology that's looking to develop really small molecules that can target hard to treat diseases. And this is where Fifi the llama comes on board. So in essence, we can use Fifi to generate these particular small molecules. So in essence, she's already at work trying to generate these nanobodies for COVID-19 and tackling the virus. But it's not far-fetched to see that we could use that or the machinery within her own immune system to develop new medicines going forward. So what do nanobodies give us? They give us the advantage of accessibility. A lot of molecules and drugs that we try to develop often have accessibility issues. They can't get to that target that we want them to go to. So by developing these real small molecules, we can then develop something that is much more accessible and can target that specific molecular target on the cell of interest. So it gives us a little bit more precision, and it allows us more opportunities in terms of how to deliver that medicine in the future. So I think we're really excited about the development of nanobodies and opening up that as a drug development pipeline for many different diseases, not just viruses.
Brilliant. I don't think we're going to top the llamas, to be honest. So that seems like a perfect in the podcast. So thank you very much, Phil. Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you for listening as well. Okay, well, that was a fantastic discussion. I very much enjoyed that. And next up, we are going to be speaking to Gurinder Singh Purwal, one of Reading's leading pharmacists.
And Gurinder will be telling us how his lecturing at Reading fits alongside his work as a pharmacist, and also all the amazing work he's been doing throughout COVID to help manage the spread of that at the University of Reading, also delivering vaccines and sharing all his knowledge with other healthcare professionals in other communities as well.
Cracking. Sounds good.